Certain images give us a snapshot of someone's life. They can be funny, serious, or intriguing. And sometimes they provide a chilling insight into a shocking situation. From terrorist attacks to plane crashes, our devices see it all, leaving behind tragic echoes of a dark future. Steve Irwin was one of the most famous wildlife presenters of all time, known for his love of animals and his daredevil approach to meeting them. Sadly, this Australian force of nature met his end when he was attacked by a stingray in the Great Barrier Reef on September 4th, 2006. After being hit in the chest by the ray's tail barb, his heart was pierced, which caused a fatal injury. Irwin was 44. The last known photo shows Irwin happily giving a thumbs up. The world is facing a period of unprecedented species extinction due to human exploitation, global warming, and pollution, to name but a few factors. But this is hardly the first time our activities has caused catastrophic species loss. An eye-opening photograph from 1892 of bison skulls from the North American West illustrates one horrific event perfectly. To put it into perspective, you have to realize that there were between 30 and 60 million bison on the continent before settlers arrived. By the time someone snapped this photograph, that population was reduced to a mere 456 wild bison. 456. For years, rumors and accusations from human rights groups claimed that Japan was illegally overfishing mink, fin, and humpback whales. As far back as the early 20th century, the international community has made agreements to limit the amount of whales caught each year. For decades, Japan claimed that it was catching whales for scientific purposes. An investigation found that some countries had been secretly paid off by Japan to support its whaling activities. A decision by the International Court of Justice in 2014 found that Japan's whaling was not for research purposes and tried to ban Japan from continuing, which it ignored. Those living in the cultural center of Vienna in 1913 may have seen some strange-looking people walking around. In particular, a short, angry-looking Austrian man with a little mustache. This was, of course, Adolf Hitler. He was based in Vienna at the time, as were future world leaders Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, and Josip Broz Tito. People who went on to become monsters at worst and dictators at best. I wonder if they took a training course together. On May 18th, 2023, Casey Rivara was hit by a vehicle at an intersection in the city of Rocklin, California. The last image of him is maybe not what you'd expect. Yes, that's Rivara helping a family of ducks cross the street. He decided to stop and come to their aid. Unbeknownst to the 41-year-old, his act of kindness would end in tragedy. Having escorted the mother and her ducklings to safety, he was returning to his car when the fatal accident happened. A teenage driver was behind the wheel. Christmas cards are supposed to be festive, fun, and preferably in shades of red and gold. But that's just me, what can I say? I love Christmas. Said the Jewish guy. In the late 1800s, though, people had different ideas altogether. Everybody wrote Christmas cards, from the elves to the dolls. And even though this particular image gives serious memento mori vibes, where photos would be taken of the dead, we can assure you that the little girl is only pretending to be asleep. This particular card is in the private archive of Oscar Anderson, a preacher involved in the Mission Covenant Church of Norway. During the Second World War, tensions were at an all-time high. And even though the Allies, made up of the US, UK, and Soviet Union, were working together, it didn't mean they trusted one another. That's why the Soviet Union infiltrated the British intelligence system through a program known as the Cambridge Five. Each spy made their way to some of the highest levels of British power in the Foreign Office. After the war ended, they defected to the Soviet Union, having completed their missions. If you don't know the name Sybil Ludington, you really should. The legend goes that at 16 she rode her horse for 40 miles in the Hudson Valley. The year? 1777, 2 years into the 8-year-long Revolutionary War. Why was she out on a horse at midnight in those turbulent times? Apparently she was rallying troops to battle British forces who were on the march. Is the story accurate, or is it a piece of propaganda? Sadly, not much evidence exists. Here's a happy-looking couple enjoying their vacation. The Nils were in Thailand on the 26th of December 2004, a truly fateful day. An earthquake in the Indian Ocean triggered a devastating tsunami that killed over 5,000 people. John and Jackie Nil were visiting from Canada. Their camera was recovered, which showed the tsunami as it crashed down on the vacation spot. Have you ever heard of the mummies of Venzone? The Black Death swept over Venzone in the 14th century. Many people died, and unfortunately there wasn't enough space to bury everyone. The townspeople decided to put 42 bodies in a mass grave in the basement of the Church of St. Michael. 300 years later, the coffins had to be moved when it was time to rebuild the chapel. Upon opening the coffins, people were amazed to discover their ancestors had been mummified. As mummies were an unknown phenomenon, the villagers believed that God had sent their ancestors back to protect the village, and an everyday life of eating, drinking, and sleeping with the mummies ensued. The mummies were treated like family, which, in a way, they were. The tradition lasted until the 1950s. In the Northern Ireland capital of Belfast, a horrifying conspiracy carried out for decades that may have gone all the way to the top. It revolved around the Kincora Boys' Home, where allegations were first made in the late 70s that young boys had been inappropriately touched and taken advantage of. However, there were also accusations that had been a government cover-up. One of the named perpetrators was a far-right activist, William McGrath, who some claimed had ties to the British MI5. In a court case taken to the High Court decades later, MI5 refused to produce documents or testify, leaving many questions unanswered. Amazingly, Jewish refugees weren't allowed to settle in the USA during World War II. In fact, authorities saw them as a security risk. Even President Roosevelt said so. The case of Herbert Karl Friedrich Bahr was used to refuse entry to other refugees. Bahr, who traveled over from Sweden in 1942, was found guilty of being a Nazi spy. This shamefully led to a massive crackdown on Jewish people seeking protection from Hitler. These are the last moments of teenagers Essa Ricker, Kelsey Webster, and her sister Savannah, captured in a selfie. The light behind them is what makes this image so chilling. You see, the girls wanted to take a picture of themselves with an oncoming train, so they took one on the Utah Railway track where they were hiking in October 2011. What they didn't know was that another train was heading straight for them. Essa and Kelsey, both 15, were killed right there. Savannah, aged 13, was taken to the hospital, but sadly died from her injuries. There's nothing like a sales meeting, right? Well, I wouldn't really know, but I do know this much. There are sales meetings, and then there are sales meetings. Take, for instance, this photo from the 1936 sales meeting of Select Baking Co. I have so many questions, but let's stick to this. Creepy as this image might be, the employees met to discuss with the Mickey Mouse Bread campaign. I know, it looks like something straight out of a horror movie, but they were probably all in high spirits. In fact, let me know in the comments if you can spot the woman in the photo. Women who were outcasts of Irish society in the 18th century were punished with a sentence to Magdalen laundries. This was a system of houses run by Catholic organizations to reform women, but instead they were used to manipulate and create forced labor. The brutal conditions went on until social pressure mounted and reached a breaking point when a mass grave full of over 150 women was found in Dublin. The last Magdalen laundry was closed in 1996. It's been part of the US since 1845, but Texas hasn't always been Texas as we know it today. Back in the early 19th century, the old Mexican Republic wanted people from outside to come and live in what would become Texas. It wasn't exactly a desirable area by any accounts. Americans settled there and they brought their slaves along to pick cotton and such. However, in 1829, the Republic wanted to emancipate or free the slaves, but some didn't want to give them up, leading to tensions that helped fuel the Texas Revolution of 1835 and 36. This changes things from the history books, which say the revolution was pretty much about colonists battling for their freedom. This image looks incredibly dramatic, but it also shows the moments before a shocking accident in the area of Shoreham, England. The Hawker Hunter jet was taking part in an air show on August 22, 2015. Pilot Andy Hill was performing a loop maneuver when he unexpectedly hit a dual carriageway on the A27 road. 11 people died. Hill survived the disaster but faced prosecution in the courts. He was cleared of manslaughter but had his pilot's license taken away. If you were an aspiring serial killer, or grave robber for that matter, the late 18th and 19th centuries would have been the place to be. During this golden age of anatomy, medical schools received the bodies of executed felons for dissection and study, as it was seen as a vile act that would, in effect, be additional punishment for the deceased's crimes. The Murder Act of 1752 legalized this tradition by requiring that medical schools dissect every murderer's body after he or she was executed. Unfortunately, it also led to a rise in black market activities, as there were never enough bodies to be dissected. As Somalia was gripped by economic and armed conflict in the 90s, the UN dispatched peacekeepers from several countries to help prevent the situation from getting any worse. However, the very people entrusted to keep the peace ended up committing atrocious acts themselves. When 2 Canadian soldiers from the Canadian Airborne Regiment fatally attacked a teen and the evidence made its way to the public, it caused an international scandal. The crime was only revealed by a newspaper article, and an investigation years later found out that the government had tried to cover up the incident. French bread is delicious, and you gotta love that long shape. Others who loved that shape were the resistance fighting against the Nazis in the Second World War. Baguettes became useful for concealing secret information. As long as they didn't encounter any hungry Nazis, well, the plan worked fine. Marco Simoncelli lived fast and died young. The 24-year-old MotoGP rider from Italy lost control of his Honda bike on October 23, 2011. Taking part in the Malaysian Grand Prix, Simoncelli collided with fellow riders Valentino Rossi and Colin Edwards from the US. He lost his helmet coming off his vehicle and later died from his injuries. One of the final images from the high-profile race reveals just how shocking and terrifying this fatal accident was. Edwards dislocated his shoulder in the chaos. The first European cases of syphilis were recorded in Europe in 1495. People would usually be covered with pustules from head to knees, eventually resulting in their flesh falling from their bodies. Most died within months after contracting the disease. Historically, syphilis was incredibly difficult to cure. Patients would frequently believe that their condition had vanished or been treated, only to see the symptoms return. Unfortunately, sexism played a major role in its spread. The doctor would conceal the cause of the illness if a wandering husband caused it, and they didn't see anything wrong with it. They believed they knew what was best. I mean, if a woman found out her husband infected her with a VD, she might make a fuss, and since the husband usually paid the bill, his interests took priority. The Cold War wasn't only fought against the Soviet Union. The US was also keeping a close eye on Cuba and doing anything it could to bring down Fidel Castro's leadership. Operation Mongoose was created under the Kennedy administration with this goal in mind. It used counterinsurgency, social pressure, and even working with the mafia. There were also reportedly over 600 assassination attempts on Castro in the years following. One with an exploding cigar, and another by planting 200 pounds of explosives underneath the stage. None of these worked, and Operation Mongoose was quietly disbanded, having failed. Meanwhile, Castro lived until the age of 90, dying in 2016. Stalin was Russia's brutal dictator, but he himself suffered a loss at the hands of the Nazis. His eldest son, Artillery Lieutenant Yakov Djugashvili, is thought to have spent years in a German prison camp after being captured. Hitler went on to use Yakov as a bargaining chip. Not that this worked on Stalin, who refused the deal. Yakov eventually died in 1943 after reportedly encouraging a guard to shoot him during a failed escape attempt. The death was kept under wraps for years. This horrifying photo shows the last moments of Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182. On September 25, 1978, the Boeing 727, containing 135 passengers and crew, flew into a Cessna 172, which had 2 people aboard. The smaller plane collided with the airplane's right wing, exploding. Flight 182 then plunged earthwards, where everyone on board was killed. 11 others lost their lives at street level in San Diego. It's regarded as one of the worst disasters of its kind in history. Whether you want to call them resistance fighters, activists, or guerrillas, you don't often find photos from the winning side of the Vietnam War. These female resistance fighters were snapped while meeting in the Nam Can forest and wore masks to hide their identities to ensure that they would not be able to identify one another if they were captured. It's a haunting image, even before you start looking deeper into the picture and notice the irregularities. There is so much going on once you start looking at their hands, feet, and whatever the photographer managed to capture in the frame by the porch and roof. Tell me, can you see it? All wars are brutal and messy. However, what happened in Argentina throughout the 70s and 80s took things to a new level. It was driven by the military dictatorship's desire to snuff out any opposition. The best way to do that was to target any left-wing groups or individuals. It took years for the full extent of the crimes to be revealed. Up to 30,000 people lost their lives, and children were even stolen from homes. How far do speeding tickets go back? Well, one of the first was mentioned in 1896 when one Walter Arnold shocked passersby traveling in his carriage at, wait for it, 8 miles an hour. It took one police officer on a bicycle to bring this animal down. Arnold then received a fine of approximately 4 pounds. I should point out that 1 pound was the equivalent of 100 pounds, or $132 in today's money. You could say this photo seems pretty unremarkable. Taken on the Hoover Dam Bypass Bridge on January 16, 2014 by a lady from the Boulder City area in Nevada, it shows Heather Price Papaiotti looking at the view. What you're actually seeing is the last known photo of Papaiotti before she ended her own life by jumping from the bridge. Aged 42, Papaiotti was suffering from anxiety and depression. She'd reportedly traveled hundreds of miles to the location following a session with her counselor. This shot was taken in July 1913 by Stéphane Passet, a French photographer hired by Albert Kahn, a billionaire banker who invented color photography using the Lumiere brothers technology. They took this picture in Mongolia, where a woman was condemned to slow and painful starvation after being buried inside a wooden crate that was to become her tomb. Initially, the bowls next to the crate had water in them, but they would not be refilled. The woman was allowed to beg for food, but any assistance would only prolong her agony, as men and women sentenced to die this way never received enough food and water from passersby to sustain them. Unfortunately, Stefana and Albert could do nothing for the woman and had to leave her in the box, as they were not permitted to interfere. In most TV shows and movies, countries like Mexico are depicted as hotspots for the drug trade. That's mainly true, especially for traffic going into the US. But is it really controlled by the notorious cartels? Traffickers have had close relationships with officials and American intelligence like the CIA going back more than half a century. Some researchers argue that these cartels are so embedded into corrupt governments that there is no difference between the Mexican state and the cartels. In the days before people knew what went into their beauty products, Victorians were busy eating arsenic. Yes, arsenic. The poisonous chemical used to bump people off in murder mysteries and such. It was an ingredient of Dr. Rose's arsenic complexion wafers, said to keep your face lily white. Because of course it will, it causes an autoimmune skin disorder called vitiligo. The Victorians were actually aware of the dangers, but believed small quantities of arsenic were safe to consume. Dr. Rose's arsenic complexion wafers. All the fun of arsenic in a wafer. This video is not brought to you by Dr. Rose's arsenic complexion wafers. A parachute suit was a great idea. Sadly, the man who invented it lost his life testing it out. Franz Reichelt wanted to show the effectiveness of his suit, so he made the fateful decision to wear it himself when falling from the Eiffel Tower on February 4th, 1912. Reichelt was positioned at the first platform, 187 feet up. The cameras captured his descent, as his parachute tragically failed. Reichelt made a crater approximately 16 centimeters wide. Such was the force of the landing. And if you are enjoying this list, or I don't know if enjoying is really the word for it, but please make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, do all of that. It really helps the channel out. Thank you so much. 115 years ago, the Michelin Man, Michelin Tire's mascot, used to be an overweight, cigar-smoking beer drinker. Those days, however, are long gone. While Bibendum, as he is known, now sports a more athletic body, the earliest designs of his likeness are absolutely horrifying. As we've seen, the Cold War was a time of intense paranoia and secrecy. One of the lesser known aspects was Hollywood creating a secret blacklist. At least 300 writers, actors, and directors who were either connected to or suspected of being communists were put on this list and effectively banned from working in the industry. This was all part of a reaction to the Red Scare, the fear that left-wing political movements would take hold in the country. Who the hell could you trust back then? But do you know what hasn't been blacklisted? Bizarre as it sounds, people went crazy for a celebrity rhino back in the 18th century. For the better part of 20 years, this magnificent beast wowed the crowd on their very own European world tour after capturing the public's imagination. There was even a name for the phenomenon: rhinomania. Clara also had a carriage drawn by 8 horses, and with her size, well, she'd certainly need them. The SS Vestris, containing 128 passengers and 198 crew, was traveling between New Jersey and the River Plate. Near the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, the ship got into serious trouble. Water flooded the Vestris through an open cargo door, and it sank on November 12, 1928. 111 people perished. What makes the story and the accompanying images even more tragic is the fact that the disaster claimed the lives of every child on board. The boat shares history with the Titanic. Both were constructed in Belfast, where work finished the same year, in 1912. Apart from the images we've listed at number 1 and 5 on today's list, you will not find a more unforgettable photo anywhere in the world. I think it's because the image encapsulates the rupture of childhood innocence during times of war. In 1937, the Japanese army bombed the Shanghai South Railway Station in China. Where there had previously been a vibrant city, the aftermath was catastrophic destruction. The child in the photo lost his mother in the bombing, but there is one silver lining to this story. His father survived, and they were later reunited. Unfortunately, the true horror is that mankind has apparently learned nothing from the past, and innocent civilians continue to be bombed to this day. Between 1920 and 1933, the US government banned the sale of alcohol to clean up society. However, this prohibition led to problems of its own. Most of all, the underground bootlegging economy created a huge revenue stream for illegal groups like the Mafia. For drinkers themselves, it could be dangerous, with around 1,000 people dying every year from tainted liquor. Some believed that it was the government poisoning alcohol themselves. In 1932, in the final year of Prohibition, the government admitted to adding toxic ingredients to the alcohol that was still allowed for industrial purposes, but they claimed that this wasn't linked to any deaths. Why write things down when you could just debate words and ideas? Amazingly, this was the view of Socrates, one of history's all-time great thinkers who lived in ancient Greece between 470 and 399 BCE. He did have his own written material in the form of scrolls, which he'd memorized. However, he wasn't keen on the general public to start writing stuff for themselves. This changes everything, because if he'd gotten his way, we wouldn't have great literature. Or shopping lists, really. Selfies are often taken during happy moments, such as the one between a son and his mother. Gary Slock, aged 15, and Petra Langerveld, aged 52, were on Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 traveling to Kuala Lumpur from Amsterdam. Part of the journey involved passing over East Ukraine, where the plane was hit by a surface-to-air missile. Everyone on board died, apparently at the hands of Russian forces, on July 17, 2014. 3 men were sentenced to life imprisonment for the crime in 2022. Throughout the course of World War II, London was exposed to a year of bombing that left substantial portions of the city in rubble, and experts feared a chemical attack from Germany was fast approaching. As you can see in this image, gas masks were made for people of all ages, even babies. The gas masks covered everything apart from their little legs. And if you've ever had the experience with babies and toddlers, you'll know that it must have been awful to get them in it. In 2016, the Montenegro government was almost shaken up in a drastic way. If police hadn't intervened, then the prime minister would have been assassinated and a new administration swooped in to take its place. 3 years later, after an investigation and a court trial, a judge found that 2 opposition leaders had collaborated with Russia. Russian leaders continued to deny the allegations, however, the evidence says otherwise. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were transferred from the Russian Secret Service to buy weapons for the coup. Let's go back to the late 15th century and the period known as the Renaissance. You'd think it was gorgeous Italian people painting masterpieces and composing music on gondolas. I mean, that definitely happened, but you'd also see gruesome figures with their limbs falling off and their faces just disintegrating. This was because of syphilis, which led to zombie-like symptoms. So while these weren't actual zombies, it would have been like living in an episode of The Walking Dead. That's a spin-off? Walking Dead, the Renaissance era. The rescue mission that entered the Tom Luang cave in northern Thailand in June and July 2018 faced considerable danger. But they had to do it, because the lives of 12 boys plus their coach Ekapol Chantawong of the Wild Boars football team were at stake. Among the rescue divers was Saman Gunan, aged 37. Despite his intense military training, he died after running out of air. The last recorded image of him is a fitting tribute to his bravery. In the late 1800s, the French neurologist Duchenne de Boulogne created an electrical stimulation machine, which he used on several people. I would be putting it mildly if I said he administered electrical currents to their faces. Duchenne photographed the involuntary emotions displayed on their faces, which were often twisted and, at times, painful due to the electric shocks. The older man in this photo appeared in many of his pictures. Because these facial expressions appeared too quickly to be sketched or painted, photography became the best tool because it can capture an event in a split second. Duchenne became one of the first scientists to use photography for medical research, and his work led to major advancements in electrophysiology. Classified documents recently released to the public have revealed that the Soviet Union knew how dangerous the Chernobyl nuclear reactor was years before its meltdown. In 1982, 4 years before the disaster, a radiation leak was reported at the plant. The Secret Service quickly arrived to keep the information from getting out. The following year, a report found that Chernobyl was the most dangerous in the country. Even a year after the disaster, a special operation swapped samples collected by an international journalist to cover up the true effects. In the end, the numbers were irrefutable. 31 deaths came quickly, while thousands died in the years to come from extreme radiation poisoning. Cat lovers, you're going to want to look away for this one. Mad scientists at Princeton University in 1929 opened up the head of a sedated feline so they could attach wires to its brain and use it as a living telephone. The idea was that by connecting the cat's auditory nerve to a receiver, you could talk into its ear and the person at the other end heard your voice. The findings of this experiment were, yikes. On August 12, 1985, a Japan Airlines plane went out of control following a shocking malfunction, resulting in the pilot being unable to fly Flight 123. The trouble started through a faulty bulkhead, with the plane experiencing a rupture shortly after takeoff. A tail fin was also missing, according to accounts. It took a reported 32 minutes for the battle against the odds to end. Flight 123 crashed into Mount Takamagahara in the Gunma Prefecture. Almost everyone died. Only 4 survived out of 524, with 1 passenger taking a photo inside the cabin before tragedy struck. I know I said that you wouldn't find a more unforgettable photo in the world than the one we had at number 15, but this one might be a strong contender. Dorothy Counts, the young lady in this photo, was among the first black students accepted to Charlotte's Harry Harding High School as part of the city's first efforts to desegregate schools. After 4 days of harassment by her peers, her parents, Dr. and Mrs. Herbert Counts, removed her from the school as they feared for her safety. The attempt at desegregation failed when the 3 remaining black students withdrew as well. What I find most harrowing is that you could almost breathe the hatred through the photo. I don't get it. It's just a different skin color. I'll never get it. I'll never get it. When a regime has its back up against the wall, it resorts to any means necessary to keep power. In Romania in 1990, that power came not through the military or police, but the people themselves. The president ordered thousands of miners to storm the capital city of Bucharest and eliminate anyone opposing the government. Mining groups had been infiltrated by secret police and directed to head to Bucharest to neutralize protesters against the ruling party. The event is remembered as the Maneriad and sent shockwaves through Romanian society. More than 3 decades later, survivors are still struggling to find justice. Does launching a nuclear rocket at the moon sound like a good idea to you? No? I'm glad it's not just me. But that's exactly what the American government wanted to do back in 1958. They seriously wondered if attacking the moon would send a strong message to their Cold War enemies that the US wasn't to be messed with. Project Nuke the Moon would definitely have changed everything, in that our weather system would be shot without its gravitational pull. Now, when in doubt, just nuke everything. That's the American way. Or grab a marker and change the trajectory of a hurricane. That'll do it. Just nuke the hurricane. That's right, you want to nuke hurricanes. Oh, awesome. The Eagles of Death metal concert at Bataclan Hall in Paris on November 13, 2015 made headlines for horrific reasons. This venue was attacked by 3 gun-wielding terrorists wearing suicide belts who started brutally executing innocent people there. These included Gilles Lecerque and Marianne Lebanon. Their selfie was the last image taken of the pair before the gunmen moved in. They and over 100 others died as part of a general campaign of terror in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower that day. The Bataclan attackers were finally blown up by their belts, but the damage they left behind was irreversible. Have you ever heard of the Skull and Bones Club? The secret society made their way to 3 Hollywood franchises, but most famous probably being the 2000 movie The Skulls. This picture shows some of its members with the Jolly Roger, the group's symbol, on the table before them. Many believe that the society has been grooming young men to become prime ministers, presidents, and world leaders since its conception. So, looking at this, we can almost believe that it's an 1800 snapshot of men plotting to take over the world. Who knows? It just might be. In 2002, Portugal was horrified to learn that a public institution had, for years, committed unspeakable crimes against the children it swore to protect. The scandal surrounded Casapia, a network of schools set up to help thousands of young people whose parents are unable or unwilling to care for them. The first allegations came in 1981, but ended without consequence. The second round of accusations led to a breakthrough. According to a lawsuit, not only were children being mistreated, but some of the country's most famous names, including politicians and celebrities, had participated in exploiting around 100 boys. Eventually, 56 people were sentenced to prison for their involvement, though many claim the conspiracy went much deeper. Could someone survive with a metal rod lodged in their brain? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. When 19th century American railway worker Phineas Gage accidentally triggered a gunpowder blast with an iron tool, it blasted the rod through the center of his skull. Ouch! Luckily, he survived the experience and died 12 years later, though of course he was never the same again. We have Phineas Gage to thank for showing a link between brain damage and changes in personality. All I could think of when I read that title was The Simpsons, the rod up that man's butt has a rod up its butt. Just full disclosure here, it's immediately what I thought of. This photo shows Brazilian football star Kleber Santana aboard Lamia Flight 2933. The date was November 28th, 2016, and the image had one caption: "In how many lives I live, in all, I will love you." Things were not right on this plane, which was at the center of the worst airline disaster of the year. A lack of fuel meant the aircraft crashed into a Colombian mountain in the Cerro del Gordo area. What makes the story even more tragic is the fact that the flight was a mere 20 kilometers from the airport. Santana died, along with 18 of his Chapecoense teammates. 71 died overall. Antonin Alexander founded the Cabaret de l'Enfer, the Cabaret of Hell, in November 1892, and it was knocked down in 1950 to clear the way for the development of a Monoprix store. The walls were reputed to be scorching hot, and visitors were tormented by a guy dressed as Satan. Notwithstanding the fact that they're eating in hell, the people in this photo look to be in high spirits. When a man named Georgios Papandreou was elected prime minister in 1964, his government was seen as too radical and dismissed by the Greek King Constantine II. But with new elections set for 1967, some didn't want to take the chance of losing to left-wing groups. A few weeks before the elections were set to take place, right-wing army leaders took power in Athens, arresting politicians and thousands who might oppose. The king quickly approved of the new military regime. In the end, though, the king, along with his descendants, would regret that move. When the military regime collapsed, the people voted to abolish the monarchy in 1973. Throughout World War II, they were deadly enemies. But there was one time they teamed up to fight Hitler. In 1945, the German-held Castle Itter in Austria was abandoned. Well, by the guards at least. I mean, the prisoners were absolutely still on site. So a plan was launched by an American tank battalion and a team of rebel Nazis to defend and protect them against approaching SS forces who would rather kill the prisoners than let them go free. Pyrotechnics bring an exciting dimension to a band's live performance. In the case of the Great White gig at the Station Club in Rhode Island, however, it became the horrific start of a fiery tragedy. On the night of February 20th, 2003, the show set off its pyrotechnics. Shockingly, these set fire to the soundproofing in the venue. The flammable material turned the happy scene into a deadly blaze. There were 100 deaths and 200 injuries. And of course, people were taking photos, offering a chilling reminder of the terrible event. You can see the pyrotechnics going off in the background there. The serial killer Harvey Glatman would become known as the Glamour Girl Slayer, because he liked to lure women into his home under the pretense of modeling work. He liked to dress his victims up for photo shoots, among other things, before tying them up and murdering them. This is an incredibly horrific photo, as it is the last known photograph ever taken of Judy Dill, his first known victim. He was arrested as he attempted to abduct his fourth victim in 1958. His trial lasted only 3 days, and he was sentenced to death. Spain, too, has a bloody history of suppressing movements that threaten the status quo. Between 1983 and 1987, their target was a Basque separatist group called the ETA. In the space of just 4 years, almost 30 ETA members were assassinated, while many more were kidnapped, intimidated, and even tortured. Hold on, no one was burned during the famous Salem witch trials? Seems like the classic story isn't accurate. Suspected witches were definitely punished in late 19th century Massachusetts. However, this happened through hanging. Not exactly a nicer option, but I guess better than burning to death, right? Plus, many of the witches ended up behind bars. This is 73-year-old tightrope walker Carl Valenda. Yes, you heard me correctly, a tightrope walker in his 70s. This German-American performer wowed the crowds with his gravity-defying feats, but people were reminded of the dangers of being at the circus when he lost his balance crossing a rope between 2 hotel towers in Puerto Rico on March 22, 1978. He was 123 feet up when he tragically fell and died. A TV crew captured Valenda's spectacular, yet terrifying, final moments. Aborigines are Australia's oldest residents, having lived on the continent for hundreds of thousands of years before the arrival of the immigrants a few hundred years ago. They experienced cruelty at the hands of the colonists, and, according to an old urban legend, were legally classified as animals until 1967. Even though the legend is nothing but a legend, they were treated like animals. Thousands of indigenous people were killed during the late 18th and early 20th centuries. In fact, according to a special report by The Guardian, there were over 270 massacres in the country over 140 years. These disparities continue to linger between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians today, with non-Indigenous having higher literacy rates, better career possibilities, and longer life expectancy. Germany wasn't all that Poland had to worry about during World War II. The Soviet Union moved in to control the eastern part of the country, wasting no time putting thousands of Polish military leaders and soldiers in prison. At least, that's what Polish representatives were told. The Soviets then claimed that the prisoners had somehow escaped and gone missing. It was only in 1943 when the truth was uncovered. German forces stumbled upon gigantic mass graves in a forest called Katyn. When all the bodies were counted, there were over 4,400. The Soviets didn't admit to what they did until the 80s. Some US presidents die violently at the hands of their assassins, and others bite the bullet due to their cherry fixation. Commander-in-Chief Zachary Taylor attended a party in 1850 where he went overboard on the cherries and milk. The fruit and dairy are believed to have given him gastroenteritis. Quite the exit for a president and a war hero, though the heat has also been linked to his death. Vehicle dash cams are important for things like solving crimes. However, they also film other serious events, such as in 2015 when a Trans-Asia flight flew low over the roofs of cars on its way to crash land in the Keelung River in Taiwan. On February 4th, the disastrous crash claimed the lives of 43 people. The other 15 survived. So, what happened? Reportedly, one of the engines failed, and in their effort to correct the situation, the pilot switched off the wrong engine. In the seconds following the atomic bomb's blast on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, so many people were incinerated that it's impossible to calculate the exact number of people who were killed. The radiation from the nuclear weapon left impressions on the walls and other surfaces of the city where people were vaporized, that it left thousands of what can only be called death shadows everywhere around the city. This photo looks like the remains of something that was possibly spilled on a porch. It is, however, the only thing that has remained of someone who was incinerated by the blast. It's a grim reminder of the horrors we so easily inflict on one another. The Treaty of Versailles was an agreement made between Germany and the Allied powers after World War I. It forced Germany to take all responsibility for the conflict, pay reparations, give up territory, and radically decrease its military to make it harder for another large-scale conflict. With the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, Germany ignored all these conditions and invaded Austria in 1938. Speaking after troops had already moved into Austria to finalize the annexation, Hitler said that he knew it was his destiny to bring Germany back to the Great German Reich. Juliana the Great Dane saved her owner's life during World War II in a surprising way. She did it by having a full bladder. When a German bomb landed in their home in Bristol, England, she put the explosive out by simply urinating on it. This act led to her receiving the Blue Cross Medal in 1941. The medal was later sold in 2013 for around $1,500. This is a stark warning to those wanting to go rock climbing and take selfies. 17-year-old hiker and free climber Carter Christensen from Minnesota was standing on a Flatirons rock face in August 2017. He was letting the world know of his achievements on social media. Sadly, he appeared to be more concerned with his camera and less with his situation. He fell for a distance of approximately 100 feet and lost his life. I know, you're eager to get to number 5, but bear with me. This picture was taken in 1919 and shows a Turkish bride. Before I continue, take a moment to look at the bride's face, and then take a look at her hands. Despite her elderly appearance, the bride is, in fact, only 16. When you take the time to look at her hands, an accurate account of her age is revealed. As a part of the Vranje Turkish modesty tradition, the girl in the wedding photo had her face covered with a gilt leaf, giving her the ancient appearance. According to tradition, she would put on a veil once her husband removed the gold leaf and wear the veil publicly for the rest of her life. Greenpeace is the most famous environmental activism group on the planet. With this power comes a lot of enemies, including companies, individuals, and even governments. When one of Greenpeace's ships, the Rainbow Warrior, was sunk at a dock in New Zealand in 1985, the French were suspected. Rainbow Warrior was part of a group of vessels protecting against French nuclear testing in the Pacific. 2 French agents had planted explosives that sank the boat, and 1 volunteer photographer was killed in the attack. France claimed that there was no connection between the bombing and their secret service, but months later, the French Prime Minister owned up to it. A Bloody Mary was first served in Paris in 1921. Now, Bloody Mary isn't the most appealing of names, but it could have been a lot worse. It started out being called a bucket of blood. Delicious. This is linked to a possible origin story for the Bloody Mary's name. There was reportedly a Chicago bar called the Bucket of Blood, which had an employee called Mary. Joseph Avery was caught on camera in the middle of a 19th century tragedy on the water. In 1853, he was the sole survivor of a 3-man boat trip in the wild Niagara River. Luck was initially on Avery's side, with a log becoming his lifeline. There were people there to witness his plight and to try and save him. The agonizing process apparently went on for hours. The crowd could only watch in horror as Avery finally let go of the log and fell to his death at the famous falls on the evening of July 19th. Can you imagine the horror of being tied to an immovable object and being whipped until your back looks like that? The slave in this picture was named Peter. Peter had been severely whipped in the fall of 1862 for unknown reasons. In March 1863, Peter fled the 3,000-acre plantation of John and Bridget Lyons, where he and 40 other people were enslaved at the time of the 1860 census. The picture was taken on April 2, 1863 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. As they took the picture, Peter said, "Overseer Atreyu Carrier whipped me. I was 2 months in bed sore from the whipping. My master came after I was whipped. He discharged the overseer." If you thought the 2020 US election was contentious, well, wait till you hear about 1924 in the UK. It started when the Daily Mail published a letter that was allegedly written by Grigory Zinoviev, a Russian leader of the Communist International Organization. The letter urged communists in Britain to ready themselves for an imminent revolution and was released just 4 days before an election. And it worked. The Conservative Party won more than 13.3% more of the vote than the Labour Party. It's now agreed that the Zinoviev letter was a forgery, used effectively to sway the public. Are you worried about dunking your mustache in your cup? Well, the Victorians had a solution for that. They called it the mustache cup, and it featured a guard that fitted over your facial hair. This protects you from any gloop that might get stuck on your face. Sadly, this invention doesn't seem to have survived into later centuries. A shame for mustache and beard wearers everywhere. Would you snowboard down Mount Everest? That's exactly what French daredevil Marco Siffredi did in 2001, and it's kind of a miracle he survived. He then tried the same thing again the following year. That time, tragedy struck. While everything looks cool and exciting in this final image of Siffredi, he would set off on his board, never to be seen again. To this day, no one is sure what happened to the young snowboarder. On June 18, 1964, shortly after noon, an interracial group of civil rights protesters leaped over a low-chain fence and jumped into the Monsoon Motor Lodge swimming pool. Jimmy Brock, the proprietor of the motel, arrived shortly after and had no qualms about throwing muriatic acid into the pool to force them out. Can you even imagine the hatred that took? Photos of the incident landed St. Augustine's increasingly vexing civil rights campaign on the front pages of newspapers throughout the country, and the harrowing image contributed to the adoption of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination in public places. Now that you've seen this image at number 4, you must be wondering what we left for number 1. In the 50s, Sweden wanted to give itself some insurance against the Russians. And what's better than developing nuclear weapons? Sweden undertook a secret program over a period of 17 years to develop tactical nuclear weapons, and had almost finished by 1965 when the government decided against it. Part of this was because of the signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, an international agreement designed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world. In the late 14th century, a child died after being attacked by a pig. Naturally, a terrible situation, and one where you'd expect the animal to be put down. And it was, only in crazy Middle Ages style. The poor creature received a visit from local law enforcement who put it behind bars. It was later hung. Whether they made it into sausages and bacon later is not clear. Indian spiritual and political leader Gandhi famously practiced nonviolence. His enemies didn't share his philosophy, as his death on January 30th, 1948 showed. The public figure was at Birla House in New Delhi when nationalists and Nathuram Ghosh opened fire. His final photo depicts a man of peace in what were to be the last moments of his incredibly influential life. If you have a pet rat, it might be a good idea to get some coffee quickly. Humans have had a rocky relationship with rodents since immemorial, but the most severe escalation of issues happened in Victorian England. Luckily, those in power in the major cities quickly devised a solution: bounties. The government was willing to pay big money to those who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty, and the rat catcher was born. Every rat could earn rat catcher money. They even got special privileges if they caught more than 5,000 a year. Most rat catchers went after wild rats. However, the more innovative ones hunted for rats in the sewers and weren't afraid to use animal helpers. When the Allies were trying to blunt Germany's attack during World War II, they went after one of its most precious resources: water. That made the small Norwegian town of Rjukan a battleground, where a huge hydroelectric power plant was supplying Germany with heavy water for research into nuclear bombs. Several operations had failed to sabotage the plant until Operation Gunnerside, where a group of 6 Norwegian commandos snuck into the facility's basement, installed explosives, and evaded the Germans by skiing all the way down the mountain to Sweden. The explosion destroyed more than 1,000 pounds of heavy water, landing a huge blow against the Germans. People with red hair have it tough today, but in ancient Greece, the prejudice was at a whole nother level. The fact that they had pale skin and needed to stay out of the sun was enough to convince the population that these guys were evil. Now, this isn't a proven fact due to the word vampire not appearing in the English language till 1732. Of course, there could have been vampires back then, only the Greeks had another name for them. Either way, it's bizarre and wrong to think that redheads are members of the undead. I have red hair in my beard. But I'm extremely Irish. It's in my heritage, so, it's there. It's just not here. It's only here. The aristocracy did not have a good time in Russia. Or rather, they did, before revolutionaries conspired to wipe them out. A famous and bloody example of this was the fate of Alexei Nikolaevich, the 13-year-old Tsarevich, or heir to the empire. His father was Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas, together with his wife and children, including Alexei, were killed by the Bolsheviks on July 17, 1918. Here is the last known image of him. When he died, it was brutal, with many attempts made to shoot and stab him due to a protective layer of gemstones under his clothes. This photo seems quite ordinary, doesn't it? We can see a smiling man wearing a bright yellow jumper with a happy boy on his shoulders. Just a lovely day out, right? Yeah, wrong. The Spanish tourists were visiting the town of Oma in Northern Ireland in 1998. Moments after this photo was taken, an IRA bomb placed inside the red car next to them detonated. Packed with over 500 pounds of explosives, the explosion killed 29 people, injured over 200, and sparked international outrage. The man and his son miraculously survived. The photographer didn't. In 1968, a B-52 bomber crashed into ice just off the coast of Greenland, near the American airbase of Thule. Most of the crew were able to eject safely before landing, but the Danish government was furious about the incident. The bomber was carrying nuclear warheads, which were banned in Denmark. American leadership quickly assured their Danish partners that the bombs were unarmed and therefore safe. But later it was discovered that this wasn't exactly true. One of the warheads had even broken open and spilled radioactive substances. It was a miracle that it hadn't detonated. This religious figure died brutally in 258 CE on the orders of Emperor Valerian. The story goes that he was placed on a gridiron and roasted to death. Nasty, but this was a fate he reportedly took in good humor. Can you believe he actually told his torturers to turn him over because he was well done on one side? Imagine being at the zoo when someone decides to jump into the water of the polar bear enclosure. That's what happened in this shocking incident at Berlin Zoo on April 13, 2009. A distressing image shows the poor woman being attacked by one of the bears. She later died from her wounds, and it later came out she was experiencing mental health issues. The 1918 Finnish Civil War erupted as Finland transitioned from its prior status as a Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire to its newfound independence. The social upheavals of World War I flowed into Finland, and conflicts arose about how the newly established government should be managed. The Reds, led by the Social Democratic Party, opposed the Whites, led by the Conservative Senate's socialist-averse majority. Roaming paramilitary organizations patrolled the countryside, with Red Guards, industrial and agrarian workers, fighting White Guards, made up primarily of peasants and middle and upper-class individuals. Our photo captured the perfectly silent moment in the time before two men were brutally executed. In 1968, all eyes were on Mexico for the Summer Olympics. Tensions were high, especially because student groups had been protesting against the government. Police were eager to clear the way, and did so by brutally cracking down on activists. Governments initially claimed that 4 people had died. However, independent investigations have estimated that this number was actually closer to 400. Not only that, but the students had been unarmed and hadn't even provoked the police. Instead, classified documents exposed a plot involving the Presidential Guard, which used snipers to shoot at police and provoke a reaction against the students. After World War II, America learned a sobering statistic. A combined total of over 400,000 people had been killed in the conflict. That included both military and civilians. 6 of these casualties died in the USA itself, which makes their deaths extremely unusual. Reports say that a woman and 5 children were hit by a balloon bomb delivered to Oregon by the Japanese. Freediving, as in diving down as deep as you can go without an oxygen tank, is an impressive feat. It's also incredibly dangerous. Even the best in the business can lose their lives. On November 17, 2013, Nicholas Mavoli from America was 236 feet down in the Bahamas. He'd reached his target depth, but of course he needed to come back to the surface. Once he got there, he tragically died. He had made it out, but there was a buildup of fluid in his lungs. A photo taken the same day shows Mavoli in the run-up to his demise. This shocking photograph, at number 1 on our list today, shows Quang Duc, a monk who set himself on fire in Saigon in 1963. He died resisting the South Vietnamese government's persecution of Buddhists. The regime did its best to make life hard for the Buddhists, from forbidding them to fly their traditional flag to banning them from exercising their faith and spiritual activities. The Buddhists had had enough. Quang Duc and 2 other monks emerged from a car near the Cambodian embassy. He sat quietly in a customary contemplative stance as another monk drenched him in gasoline from head to toe. Quang Duc didn't even blink as the other monk lit a match and set him on fire. Passers-by were generally astonished, but a few stopped to pray as the monk burnt alive. His protest was not ignored. Within hours, the image was making headlines all over the world. To this day, it's hard to look at the image without noticing the monk's peaceful demeanor while he's burning to death. The pain must have been excruciating. I believe nobody said it better than JFK himself. when he said, "No news picture in history has generated so much emotion around the world as that one." Canadian public policy towards Indigenous people has been a centuries-long conflict. Beginning in the 1880s, the government opened schools to assimilate them into Canadian society. This meant banning local languages and customs and being subject to routine mistreatment. At the time, these policies were claimed as a progressive way to assist Indigenous people to achieve an education. However, it was later described as cultural genocide. In 2021, 751 unmarked graves of children were found at one of these schools. Ancient Roman gladiators were apparently so popular you could buy merchandise after watching their violent exploits. They had their very own clay action figures, which I'm guessing weren't very posable. Plus, things got icky with a few drops of sexy gladiator sweat. Why not spread it all over yourself as an ancient aphrodisiac? You could also purchase items such as oil lamps and glassware that showed exciting scenes from their battles. This makes modern-day toy collectors look like small potatoes.